All right, welcome everybody, and welcome to our final fall of member lecture series. If this is your first time, there's a couple of you who have bought tickets for tonight, but you can always become a member for just $50. We will have, I already have listed right now, 7 lectures in the spring, so we'll probably end up with about 10 or 12. So we got a lot of great stuff that's going to be upcoming. We have our Rex Den showing in late January. We have our history of Carnival class in late January. I mean early January. Obviously Creole Christmas, and then our symposium. So if you have not checked out our symposium, it's going to be on the Marquis de Lafayette. Some background on him as well as his time in New Orleans, where he spent 5 days, which was very unusual for his trip. So we're going to learn a lot about that. That is December 14th. Everything is recorded. It's all on Zoom. You can watch it at your own leisure, but we have speakers from all over the country coming and speaking. And we have 7 different presentations. So I hope you take advantage of that. But tonight we're going to be talking about something that is just a cultural icon moment in New Orleans. And luckily we have an unbelievable resource in Bruce Spitzer, who has written now, Bruce, 12, 13, 20, how many books?
16 books on the Beatles,
16.
and it's actually pronounced Spizer.
Spicer, Bruce, sorry about that.
That's okay.
And
I've been called worse.
And Bruce has written 16 books, and he's going to be talking about our the 60th anniversary of this Beatles concert, which was just an unbelievable experience. Maybe today you could compare it to the Swifties of a couple weeks ago, who took over the city, and maybe that that comparison can be made. But Bruce, I want to welcome you tonight to the Friends of the Cabildo Lecture Series, and thank you so much for speaking to us tonight.
Glad to be here, and I think after you see this presentation, you will say that the Swifties were certainly remarkable, but nothing like the crowd that was in City Park Stadium on Wednesday, September 16th, 1964. And what you're seeing on the screen is a picture of the stage and a ticket from that concert. And with that, shall we get going? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So we're going to get rocking and rolling. So to set things up, there was a lot going on that caused Beatlemania to explode in America. And that is in my book, The Beatles Are Coming, The Birth of Beatlemania in America. The short story is the first 3 Beatle records released in the United States, Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You, all initially flopped. And then the Beatles were signed to Capitol Records, and Capitol promoted the Beatles with a $40,000 budget to get the word out about the Beatles. They had these stickers everywhere. They had magazines, and it was a big deal. They had 40,000. That's about $250,000 in today's money to promote this new band from England. They issued the single, I Saw Her Standing There, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. I Want to Hold Your Hand, of course, was the big hit. And then She Loves You, which had originally flopped, was reissued and became a #1 hit. Please Please Me was reissued, and it became a big hit. VJ released the album introducing the Beatles, and it sold over 1 million and got to 2 on the album charts. And Capitol had Meet the Beatles, which sold 3.6 million in a couple of months and got to #1 on the album charts. The Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show. Normally 20 to 30 million people would tune in. That night, 73 million people tuned in. A remarkable audience for them. The Beatles played the Washington Coliseum to a sellout crowd. The Beatles played Carnegie Hall, 2 shows to sellout crowds. They were again on the Ed Sullivan Show from Miami Beach. And when they headed back to England, their airplane was renamed Jet Clipper Beatles. And even though it was a freezing night in New York, you can see a large crowd came out to send them off and tell them goodbye. And it was quite a job for the policemen to hold back the crowds. You just love those faces. Well, anyway, while that was going on, the Beatles got back, and there was no rest for the weary after that trip because they needed to record songs for an upcoming film they were going to be doing called A Hard Day's Night. And in the States, Capitol released another Beatles album, the Beatles' second album. And around this time, their manager, Brian Epstein, began setting up their 1964 tour of North America. And you might wonder, well, why did the Beatles go to New Orleans? It was a relatively small market. The reason was the Beatles had this fantasy idea that they could go to New Orleans, walk around the city, see its charm, and hear some good music in New Orleans. Of course, that would have been very difficult. This is the actual contract with GAC for the Beatles at City Park Stadium in New Orleans, September 16th. And you can see that it required a down payment of $10,000, and the Beatles got $20,000 guarantee plus 60% of the box office receipts. So that was the deal, and it was signed by Herb Holloway of Holodam Productions, and he was also involved with WNOE. So not surprisingly, WNOE was the official sponsor radio station for the concert. This concert had a rider, and one of the interesting things on the rider was that the purchaser agreed to supply police protection for the Beatles. There had to be at least 100 uniformed officers, and they would be present for at least an hour prior and 30 minutes after. And if producer thought more was needed, there would be more. The purchaser would arrange for a general press conference the day of the engagement. And this was an interesting one. The Beatles would not be required to perform before a segregated audience. The Beatles had heard that sometimes in the South things were segregated, and so for that reason, the Beatles wanted to make sure that would not happen at their concert. Prior to the Beatles arriving in New Orleans, the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night came out, and Beatle fans flocked to the theaters to see the film. And this is the scene from the Scala Theater where fans were going and screaming wild. The Beatles wanted to stay at the Roosevelt Hotel, home of the famous Flu Room for dining and dancing. And so this is a picture of the Roosevelt Hotel. And if you look at this picture, you can see Canal Street. You'll notice the streetcars have been removed by the time the Beatles came to New Orleans. They were removed in early 1964. Now, where did the Beatles end up? Well, they ended up at the Congress Inn on Chef Mentor Highway. It was basically what we would call a motor hotel. This was a picture of the construction of the Congress Inn, and the Congress Inn was 2 minutes from Michoud, the space age. And that's what they were doing. And they had this famous Congress Inn welcome sign, similar to their version of the Holiday Inn sign. They also had a lounge called the Coach House. And for guests there, they had an Olympic pool, water skiing, a deluxe, billiard lounge, radio, music, and TV. So it was the absolute finest in motor hotels. And once again, a picture of the luxurious Congress Inn, not exactly the Roosevelt Hotel. The Times-Picayune had done an article on the Congress Inn when it was first opening up, talking about new luxury for visitors. And this is a picture of their billiard room. And the reason I'm showing you this is the billiard room would have a different use on September 16th. And of course, the famous Coach Lounge. The Beatles, meanwhile, were going across America, and they had chartered an airplane from American Flyers. And this is a Lockheed Electra turboprop that the Beatles were flying on. And here we have an article on all the craziness that happened to the Beatles, saying they came in with a comedy of errors, and we'll get to that in a minute. This is Lakefront Airport, where the Beatles were supposed to land. However, best laid plans. All the fans were at Lakefront Airport to see them. A city councilman, Dan Kelly, was going to represent the mayor and give him a proclamation. The Orleans Levee Board president was there representing Governor John McKithen. And then they were going to take a helicopter to the Congress Inn. However, there were problems with Lakefront Airport. The helicopter blew an engine, so they couldn't use it. So they sent the limousines to Moisson Airport by mistake. And so also the captain of the Lockheed Electra was concerned about landing at Lakefront Airport due to the weight of the plane and the relatively short length of the runways. So they were diverted over to the Moisson Airport. The limousines got there, and NOPD sped Councilman Kelly to Moisson, and deputies and 30 levee board police called it a night over at the Lakefront Airport. And here we see Beatle fans who waited in vain at the wrong airport, shown in the Times-Picayune. The Beatles were landing at Moisson Airport, And this is what it looked like in the 60s. We didn't have that brand new airport. But for some kids who were just luggage handlers that night, they were lucky. They were in, as Dr. John would say, the right place, well, at the right time, this time rather than the wrong time. And these ramp agents were told to stay to assist in diverting Electra, which happened to have the Beatles. They helped them with the luggage, and off the Beatles went to Congress Inn. And sirens, according to the paper, were screaming louder than their fans, which I find difficult to believe. And this is the long and winding road that the Beatles took, starting in Kenner and going all the way out to Chef Mentor. They did Airline Highway, David Drive, Betts, Pontchartrain Boulevard, Robert E. Lee, Elysian Fields, Leon C. Simon, Dowman Road, Morrison Road, Patterson Road, finally to Chef Mentor Highway. And the Beatles arrive at last at Congress Inn. However, once there, the comedy of errors continued. The limo made a wrong turn and they were able to be followed by screaming fans. The girls rushed and surrounded the car, and the police finally pushed off the hysterical youths. The driver turned the limo around and he missed his do or die teenagers, but he actually smacked into a Kenner police car. And then the limo was supposed to drop the Beatles off in front of their 3-room suite number 100, but instead it pulled to the entrance where screaming fans were awaiting. And here we see the Beatles with the fans being escorted through the hallway. You can see Ringo does not look happy. Here is a picture of the Beatles that was in the Times-Picayune, and there they are with one of their press agents, Derek Taylor, at last arriving at the hotel. And here is another picture, and Paul, ever the PR person, has a smile on his face. And also, the final snafu, the Beatles wanted some food, but the Congress Inn kitchen was closed, so food was ordered from Martin Brothers Restaurant. And then the Times-Picayune reported that Councilman Kelly never got to welcome the Beatles, but he did get to pose with 3 Memphis teenage girls who took the train to the Union Passenger Terminal in a cab to Congress Inn, where they were invited to be guests of the motel free of charge. Very nice of Congress Inn. There was also 15-year-old Creeby Clay, who was waiting in the lobby at 3 a.m. And this distraught teenager gave a Kenner policeman a doll to give to Ringo with all of her love. The 11-year-old here had slipped out of her house without permission, and somehow this 11-year-old made it to Lakefront Airport and Congress Inn all on her own. That's how dedicated the fans were. There were 100 fans at the Congress Inn in the middle of the night. Most of those had previously been at Lakefront Airport. There were only 8 fans at Moyzan Airport to greet the Beatles when they first arrived. And here we see a fan where she saw the idols pass at Congress Inn. She saw them, but she wanted to touch them. But they had ham and eggs and orange juice for a late breakfast. They dressed for a 7 o'clock press conference, and the press conference was held in the billiard room. And here we see the Beatles in the billiard room with the Welcome Beatles to the Congress Inn sign. And here we see people gathered around the table. And their press officer, Derek Taylor, said, "Are there any non-journalists here?" And of course, no one admitted to being a non-journalist, not even the 5-year-olds in the room. And here we see, obviously, this cute little girl who is not a journalist getting John to sign a copy of his book for her. And she is quite excited by this. Now, Mayor Schiro presented each Beatle with a key to the city and a certificate of honorary citizenship. And John said, "I'd like to put my arm around you. You look like a nice fellow, Lord Mayor." In Liverpool, the mayor was called a Lord Mayor, so that's why John referred to him as such. And here we see the Beatles with Lord Mayor Victor Schiro. Schiro then presented the Beatles with a proclamation. And the proclamation was a very special document. And it started off by saying, "Whereas the Beatles are coming," which whereas this event will be acknowledged, assented to, and even acclaimed by presumably a large segment of our people. And whereas the Beatles what the Beatles do and sing is based on a cousinship with jazz, the jumping, danceable historic art form, which New Orleans has contributed to world culture. And whereas, in order to be hospitable to our English cousins, the Beatles, who will serenade New Orleans in the hurricane month of September, it devolves upon myself to officially welcome this English storm. Now, therefore, I, Victor H. Skiro, Mayor of the City of New Orleans, do hereby proclaim the day, Wednesday, September 16th, 1964, to be Beatles Day in New Orleans. And the proclamation here was signed by Mayor Victor Skiro. It was also signed by each of the Beatles. How do we know that? Well, those are their signatures. And also we see Paul with his left hand signing the proclamation. And then after the Beatles finished signing, the mayor started to leave, and John noticed he had left his pen, and he called out, "You forgot your pen, your lordship." And then the proclamation was there for Mayor Skiro to take with him. The press conference continued, and the Beatles were asked a series of questions. The Beatles always tried to be witty at their press conferences, even though they were frequently asked the same old routine questions. Reporter, what do you like most about being wealthy? Ringo, money. Reporter, what do you think of topless bathing suits? Paul, we've been wearing them for years. Reporter, what do you think of New Orleans girls? John, we haven't seen any. Reporter, do you intend to visit New Orleans again? John, when we're older. And so you can see it went on, and this was a typical Beatles press conference. Now, the Beatles did say that New Orleans was one of the roughest spots on their American tour, and they blamed the mix-up in the arrival plans and a lack of security at the Congress Inn, and then also the mayhem that went on at City Park Stadium, which we will get to in a little bit. Here we see City Park Stadium, the day of the concert, and you can see a lot of people are there, some of them in their Catholic girls' school skirts, others in their Beatles sweatshirts, and they're all there, all excited for the concert. And this was what a ticket to the concert looked like. You can see it was $5. It was a Wednesday evening, and the concert was starting at 8 p.m. WTIX, even though WNOE was the official sponsor, hijacked the concert. They brought their disc jockeys out there, and they handed these out to all the people waiting in line and entering. WTIX welcomes you to the Beatles concert. You can see this one was even signed by two of the boss jocks, Skip Wilson and Johnny Fever. And these particular photos were sold as souvenirs at the concert. And here we see the girls waiting at the gates of heaven, ready to enter City Park Stadium. And now what we're going to do is let you know that they had to wait for warm-up acts. And so there was the Bill Black combo that started things off. And then the Exciters that had had a big hit, Tell Him. And then also Jackie DeShannon. And of course, Clarence Frogman Henry, whose biggest hit was Ain't Got No Home, although he had some others such as You Always Hurt the One You Love. And of course, I Don't Know Why I Love You, But I Do. Now, we also have here Frogman Henry autographing a picture with the Beatles. Now, we also see the Beatles with Fats Domino, and the late, great, and sadly late Eric Paulson became good friends with Fats. And Eric told me a story where when he talked to Fats Domino about the Beatles, and he said, Fats, when the Beatles came to New Orleans, did you get to meet them? And Fats famously said, no, they got to meet me. And looking at this photo, you can see how delighted the Beatles are to meeting their heroes. Now, the next part of the talk, we're going to have some fun tonight. What I'm going to do is play some audio. And the audio clips of the Beatles talking are from the City Park Stadium. The music is from a different concert, but basically the exact same songs the Beatles were playing. And all the photographs you're about to see were photographs taken by a professional photographer on the night of that concert. So we'll be able to fully experience what it was like to be in City Park Stadium that night. And here are the Beatles opening up with their first song.
you very much. Hello? Hello? Yes. Hello? Thank you very much and good evening. How are you? Can you hear this? Yeah? Good. Thank you. The next song we're going to try and sing through these loudspeakers. Another old song of ours from last year. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Oh. The song's called She Loves You.
When the Beatles were performing there, this was in 1964, there were no onstage monitors. So the Beatles were having, of course, great difficulty hearing themselves playing, hearing the vocals. The crowd was screaming wildly, and it was very difficult. They were playing on instinct at this point in time. Now, of course, the Beatles were on a stage on the field, and the fans were in the stands at City Park Stadium, where they were supposed to remain. However, during Camp Buy Me Love, things get really wild. And Paul, we're going to hear Paul telling the audience to stop your feet and join in and sing. And well, they get a little bit more aggressive than Paul intended during Camp Buy Me Love. And you're going to see from some of these pictures how wild and crazy things got during that song.
Thank you very much. Oh well, I was going to say something, but I won't bother. We'd like you to join in with this song, if you will. Will you join in with the song? Okay? It's easy. All you got to do, as we're singing, clap your hands. Just clap your hands. Okay? Clap your hands. Or if you don't want to clap your hands, stamp your feet on the floor. Yeah, that's it. Clap and stamp. Make a bit of noise. The song we'd like to sing is called Come Buy Me Love. Those of you that are still alive.
John comes on after that and he says, "Thank you, folks. Those of you that are still alive." It was quite a crazy scene. One of the things, if we look at this picture closely here, we have a girl sitting in a wheelchair. You'll notice there are several other empty wheelchairs. Some girls got the bright idea to be closer to the stage that they would rent a wheelchair and one of their friends would assist them. And miraculously, when the Beatles came on stage, these girls were cured and they were able to walk again. So one of the fun things there, and I did talk to someone at the concert who confessed that she was one of the people who was sitting in a wheelchair and then totally lost it when the Beatles came on and jumped out of the wheelchair. There also was some film shot by WDSU TV, and here are 3 frames of it, and you can see NOPD on horseback. And during the Pandemonium, you had NOPD chasing after some of these girls on horseback and trying to pick them up and get them back into the stands. Now, Paul is going to be introducing a song here for Ringo to sing. And Ringo was the most popular Beatle in the United States at that time. So here we have Paul introducing Ringo, the most popular Beatle. And of course, all the girls were going wild for Ringo. Now, the interesting thing here was the Beatles, of course, had observed all the fans running around on the football field, or a pitch, as it is called in the UK. And so John makes a comment about everybody playing football in the middle of the pitch before he introduces the song A Hard Day's Night, which we're going to hear right now.
Playing football in the middle of the pitch. Oh, well. Anyway, the title song from the film was just made, and it's called A Hard Day's Night.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night, I should be sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, all the things that you do, it will be alright.
And of course, all good things must come to an end. The Beatles were only on stage for these concerts a little bit under a half hour. I really don't think these screaming teenagers could have taken it had the Beatles been on the stage any longer. Like today, where a concert, Paul's on stage for 2.5 hours, but of course, it's not nonstop screaming the whole time. And so on this next clip, Paul is going to introduce the last song. And if you listen carefully, he's going to thank everybody for coming, including the football players, once again, recognizing the girls who ran down to the pitch. And here is Paul introducing the last song of the concert.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you kindly, folks. Thank you. We'd like to carry on, but this next song will have to be our last song for this evening. It's going to be the last one. So before we go, we'd like to say to everybody here tonight, including the football players, thank you very much for coming along. Thank you very much. And we hope, thank you. And we hope you enjoyed the show. We'd like to finish off with a song which we recorded recently, that was written by Little Richard. And the song's called Long Tall Sally.
And then it was over. And there we see the New Orleans police barricades that were not enough to keep the girls and the guys off the field, contrary to rumors that only girls attended the show. Obviously, there were young guys there as well. There you see a camera where she was popping in flash bulbs to get those pictures of the show. And then it was time for the Beatles to say goodbye and drive off in the limousine. Now, WDSU TV, as did other stations, used to have an editorial, and they had an editorial which they dealt with the Beatles, and they also had somebody named Chase, a cartoonist, John Chase, and he would do an editorial cartoon. So in honor of the Beatles, both the editorial and the editorial cartoon by Chase dealt with the Beatles, and I'm going to play that clip right now, and hopefully it will work perfectly.
Editorial. Here is John Corporon.
Mothers and fathers of New Orleans, you may have concluded that your sons, but especially your young daughters, were growing restless this week because the Nazi rate hearings resume tomorrow. Or perhaps you assumed that Thursday's scheduled arrival of Senator Barry Goldwater was creating a stir among the teenage set. What else would account for the wave of restlessness and the thrill of anticipation that have been making the rounds? Are these young people attending a sorority rush party or waiting for a date? Were they early arrivals at the school library? Our roving photographers took additional pictures in the middle of the night that may give some meaningful clues. Youth may be having its fling in New Orleans, but around the world there were more serious matters attracting attention of the serious-minded.
Faces can tell the story of other matters of importance going on today. Khrushchev is again threatening, this time his communist colleague. He stares daggers at Mao. Tomorrow, Goldwater brings a campaign for president to the city. His visit poses a problem for Skiro, who would like to be a good host and remain a good Democrat. But for New Orleans tonight, 4 young visitors from England seem to top the news.
Close your eyes.
A real classic editorial cartoon by John Chase, drawing Beatles' hair on his figure for the city of New Orleans, on Khrushchev, Mao, Barry Goldwater, and Mayor Vic Skiro, because the Beatles were on everyone's mind. And here is some of the footage that WDSU shot of the concert with the police and everybody trying to control the girls who were trying to get on the field. As you can see, some of them too much, some of them fainted. A bit frenzied. It's a shame we don't have sound for this. Bit much for her, obviously, and her as well. Oxygen being given to that fan, first aid attended to others. So as you can see, things were pretty crazy. And of course, the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans States Item, which were the 2 papers, one came out in the morning, one came out in the late afternoon, gave coverage of the concerts. They had some pictures of Beatlemania from the show, and also a report about the riot by the teenage fans. Beatles spark riot by teen fans. Many faint, 2 injured. The Liverpool sound of Britain's Beatles was the battle anthem that started a mob of New Orleans teenagers into a riot at City Park Stadium last night. Screaming, howling, clawing, crying, and even laughing young females, about 700 rioters, according to Police Superintendent Joseph I. Juriso, attempted to storm the bandstand to get at their beloved Beatles. So they estimated 700 people ran down onto the field. Looked like more to me than that. It took the full force of the 152 policemen assigned to the stadium, plus some of the 75 hired Pinkerton agents to hold back the surging girls, abetted by a score of teenage boys. They leaped from the stadium onto the field and rushed through a police cordon. Mounted patrolmen, we saw them on the horses, assisted in corralling the main element, while elsewhere on the field, the police were busy tackling latecomers who had decided to leave the stands and join the action. City Park Stadium will probably never see such inspired broken field running nor such a determined defense, making the allusions to the high school football games that were played in City Park Stadium then and still are. For about 15 minutes, they battled police to get to the stage. I've never seen anything like this, Chief Geruso said after the pandemonium ended. I've never seen anything so amusing and yet so tragic. One boy suffered a broken jaw. One girl broke her arm. Both refused medical aid until after the concert ended. Ammonium was administered to 150 fainting females. Police alternately charged their young adversaries and treated those who had collapsed with smelling salts and maybe smiling faces, who knows. Even after the Beatles left, the crowd would not leave. Girls with tears in their eyes, some with a glassy stare of one under hypnosis, just stood there looking at the stage. Others busied themselves picking up the grass whereupon had trod Ringo Starr, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney. And I've actually talked to girls that saved the grass and put it away, and some of them still have what's left of that grass from that night. The concert began at 8 p.m. The Beatles took the stage at 9:25 p.m. The crowd was estimated at about 13,000. The stadium at that time held 26,500. After all, it was a school night. When the Beatles arrived, the din bested that of even Tiger Stadium when LSU meets Ole Miss. That's saying something. And the Beatles were heading to Kansas City, where they would be paid $150,000. Now, you saw the Beatles at the City Park Stadium concert. They were going to get a guarantee of $20,000 and some of the gate. So what was this about? Well, the Beatles wanted to have a full day off in New Orleans. And there was a guy named Charles Finley, who was the owner of the Kansas City Athletics, who later moved to Oakland to become the Oakland Athletics. But at the time, he was in Kansas City, and his daughter wanted to see the Beatles play in Kansas City. And he was determined, as a matter of civic pride, to get the Beatles to play in Kansas City. So he got on the phone and he called up Brian and he said, I'd like for the Beatles to play in Kansas City. I've looked at the schedule and they have a day off on the 17th, and I'd like to have them play in Kansas City. I will give you $50,000. And Brian said, it's the boys' day off. Charlie Finley said, make that $75,000. Brian said, it's their day off. Charlie Finley, doing some math in the back of his head, said, make it $100,000, realizing he could not break even paying that much money. Brian said no. Well, what's another 25 to Charlie Finley? $125,000. Brian still said no. Charlie went up to $150,000, at which time Brian said, I'll have to ask the boys. Brian went into their room. They were playing cards, and he said, somebody is willing to pay you $150,000 to play a show in Kansas City. The problem is that's on your day off in New Orleans. And John looked up and said, Epi, whatever you want to do is fine with us. Brian figured, I'm not going to turn down $150,000. That's, well over about $750,000 or more, about $1 million in today's dollars. And so the Beatles lost their day off, but were a lot richer for doing so. There was additional articles in the paper, and this one talked about teenage bedlam reigning at the Beatles' appearance. Police had their hands full tackling the wild crowd. Some 700 teenagers broke out in disorder at City Park Stadium Wednesday night, midway through a spirited stage appearance by England's madcap Beatles. Policemen had to physically tackle some of the youths, mostly girls, who broke away from the stand, attempting to crash through the barricades, separating them from the long-haired singers. The crowd was finally brought under control after police roped off most of the spectators to the sidelines of the football field. And then New Orleans used to have columns, and this gentleman, Herman Deutsch, well, He didn't have good things to say. He had little help for Beatlemaniacs. That sick-making exhibition by a lot of pre-adolescent female lackwits took the rag off the bush. He further said, these shills contained others into hysterical excess that would have revolted a shoveler of slaughterhouse refuge. That's pretty strong, Herman. He went on to say, if the upcoming female generation is typified by the green sick exhibitionism that was put on view at City Park Stadium Wednesday night, then I'm disturbed about what havoc an addled next generation of youngsters will wreak in a shuddering world. Pretty strong stuff. Lanyap by Thomas Griffin was another one of the regular columns in the paper. And he said the Beatles can and do fill whole column. He said it was bedlam, and one couldn't help but wonder what was the secret of the strange effect the Beatles had on their fans to literally mesmerize them with their appeal. He said he couldn't figure it out. He attended the Congressman press conference, and as he drove out of that jam-packed parking area, all he could think was, I'm glad I'm getting away in time. I'm happy I'm not going to the stadium. And then in Rumalad, another column, this one by Howard Jacobs. The pandemonium at City Park Stadium that attended their brief performance Wednesday night was a frightening thing that might have ended in a full-fledged riot, except for the numbers and determination of the police department, good old NOPD. He went on to say the spectacle of frantic young adults dashing across the field, utterly oblivious to police lines of personal safety, was a frightening commentary on the terrifying effect of mass hysteria. Hey, we just called it Beatlemania. He went on to say, we doubt that the pagans of old in their wildest orgies were even more fanatical or possessed than these frantic young girls as they struggled convulsively with harassed policemen. He went on to say, exclaimed one presiding officer when it was over, if we never see the Beatles again, it will be too soon. And Pi Dufour had his a la mode column. Now, he said that in a 64 column in February 19th, he wrote, I'll bet that by summer vacation, the Beatles will have been forgotten by our teenagers. And he was man enough to admit he was wrong. He admitted the Beatles were not forgotten, are still going strong, came to New Orleans and caused teenagers to swoon and almost riot, and spent a month in the U.S. earning over $1 million. He hoped to be reinstated with the Beatle lovers of America. Good old Pi Dufour in his a la mode column. Now, this young lady here, she also had a column for the paper, and this was Aunt Jane was her name, and she got to interview Paul. And she was impressed, as well as the team. She said at the press conference, the Beatles were friendly, saying they would really like to get closer to their fans, and she observed that they were clever, witty, very quick on the uptake, relaxed, well-dressed, and thick on British accents. Aunt Jane went on to say, the Beatles drove out onto the stadium field amid the most screaming Aunt Jane has ever heard anywhere. Flashbulbs popped so effectively that they appeared to be keeping perfect beat with the incomparable Beatles music. And she added, wasn't it fun and exciting? She went on to say, it doesn't look like they will be coming back anytime in the foreseeable future, but when they do, Aunt Jane hopes she will be there not only to welcome them again, but to see and enjoy them perform. Alas, the Beatles would not come back to New Orleans as a group. WNOE prepared special items for their listeners, including cut-up bed sheets, cut-up microphone parts and cords, and pictures. And here are the things. If you called into the station, you could be a winner and get a piece of sheet. It says right here that the portion of the bed linens used by Ringo, Paul, George, and John during their visit of New Orleans will be among your prize Beatle possessions. Yours truly, WNOE. And then the manager of the Congress Inn said, this is to certify that WNOE purchased all of the bed linens used by the Beatles during their visit to New Orleans for the WNOE Beatles Concert at City Park Stadium on September 16, 1964. And this was even notarized to make it even more official. by Robert L. Atkinson III. And here we see the same basic treatment with the microphone cords, except this time the person going before the notary is the president of Sound by Editorial on Diamond Street in New Orleans, certifying that WNOE purchased 5 of the microphones used by the Beatles for the show, including the cords. And here are some of the pictures that WNOE gave to listeners of their station. Now, this is a poster that I've seen many times in New Orleans from the concert, supposedly, and people will tell me that this is one of their most prized Beatle possessions, a concert poster from the City Park Stadium. I am sorry to inform you that this is not a genuine poster from the stadium. It is what we call a memorable piece, but there was no official poster for the concert that I'm aware of. This was certainly not done. It was done on the same stock paper, but it was done, I believe, in the 1980s. One of the dead giveaways for it is, think about it, concerts are promoted within weeks of the event, and so there's no reason to put the year. A genuine poster from that era would have said September 16th. It wouldn't have said 1964 in all likelihood. Also, some people have albums. This one, Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Beatles. VJ put a banner on some of their albums of this particular one saying souvenir of their appearance at, and then it would be different cities. This one says at City Park Stadium, New Orleans, September 16th, 1964. These albums were not sold at the concerts. They were sold in record stores in New Orleans. If you have one that said the Cow Palace in San Francisco, you would have bought that in a record store in San Francisco. Now, this is the proclamation itself from Beatles Day in New Orleans. Vic Skiro realized that it would be a nice souvenir to make photocopies of the proclamation and make them available to the citizens of New Orleans. And what he did about a week or two after the concert was, if you came down to City Hall and you pledged to pick up litter, you would get a proclamation. Skiro inserted his picture into the proclamation with the Beatles, and this is what they got. And if you look at the top, it says, "To a member of the Beatles battalion who pledges to defeat the litter bugs." And here we see Skiro swearing in the girls who are going to pick up litter. Once again, another shot of Skiro swearing in these girls to pick up the litter. And here we see an overhead shot of our bald mayor giving these proclamations to very excited fans. And also you'll see on the table, those WTIX flyers were also being handed out. One girl got Vic Skiro to sign her arm. And we see Skiro signing autographs for people that wanted him to do so. And once again, signing autographs in the WTIX flyers that were handed out at the concert. This is a proclamation without the Litter Brigade language at the top. And if you went to City Hall on your high school trips, or it actually wasn't high school, they were lower school trips. When I was in the 3rd grade at Newman, we went to City Hall, we sat in the mayor's office, and we each were given one of these proclamations. And here is my proclamation that I got when I went to City Hall as a 3rd grader. Now, if you want to read all about the Beatles tours, a good buddy of mine, Chuck Gunderson, did a book called Some Fun Tonight. It's a double set book. It goes through each of the concerts on the 64, 5, and 6 tours, including the New Orleans tour. I highly recommend it. There is also a book out by an attorney named Stephen Landry called Beatles Day in New Orleans. This is a picture of me. You've been hearing my voice. That is what I looked like a few years ago before my hair went completely white. And my books are available on my website. Very easy to remember, Beatle.net. The earlier books that I wrote on VJ and Capitol tell of these early great music. Those books are sold out, but they're available in digital PDF editions from the website Beatle.net. The book, The Beatles Are Coming, is still available. And these are the latest 2 books that I did, very relevant to this talk, because they talk about the great music that the Beatles were putting out at that time. The Beatles, Please Please Me, to With the Beatles. It has both the UK and the American albums, and the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night and more, once again with the British and American albums. These books are part of what will be a 9-book series called the Beatles Album Series that will cover all of the Beatles albums released during their heyday. The 9th book is not out yet. I'm working on it now, and it will cover Beatles for Sale to Help, and books by Bruce Spizer, once again available through Beatle.net. And with that, my presentation has come to an end, and I'll be happy to stick around and answer questions.
Yeah. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to ask them. You could also unmute yourself after a couple questions from me. So Bruce, you mentioned that 13,000 or so was at the concert, right?
Yes, although you know, by people who have claimed to have been there, it's probably a lot closer to 100,000.
Well, that was my second one was going to be. So 13,000, was that the normal kind of going concert attendance of the Beatles in the
I think for a
64?
market of this size on a school night, yes.
Yeah.
You know, they did play to larger audiences. You know, you might get 20, 25,000 in larger cities. And then a year later in 1965, the Beatles had the audacity to play Shea Stadium and fill it up with 55,000 people, which was a record that stood for many years for the largest amount of people to see a music concert.
And that was their last concert, right? Hypothetically.
That was not their last concert. Shea Stadium, they played it in 65, also 66. Their last concert was in San Francisco at Candlestick Park in 1966.
And just do you remember off the top of your head just an estimate of how many people showed up for that one?
25,000.
25,000. Okay. So I mean, it's kind of crazy that the Shays that they brought in those bigger shows. And then in terms of how many people have told you that they've gone to that concert, the
And
64 show.
people are honest about it, some of them, but it's kind of like Tom Dempsey's field goal. You know, how many people were there to see that?
Is there any speculation or any idea of what the Beatles were planning to do on that day off?
I think they wanted to just, you know, walk around the French Quarter and wanted to meet some of their musical heroes. And they did get to meet Fats Domino at least. And they wanted to go to a club and hear some music, you know, hear some New Orleans jazz and some rhythm and blues.
I'm sorry if I missed it earlier, but who opened for them? And that person did also mention you opened them for multiple shows, right?
Clarence Frogman Henry replaced the Righteous Brothers about halfway through the 1964 tour. The Righteous Brothers at the time were doing Blue Eyed Soul. They hadn't, you know, were doing songs like Little Lappy Latin Lou. They hadn't done You've Lost That Loving Feeling or anything like that. And they were getting tired of being on stage and hearing girls screaming, "We want the Beatles."
Yeah.
And about halfway through the tour, they asked if they could lead the tour. And Brian said, yes, they could. And the person who had put the tour together for GAC, one of his clients was Clarence Frogman Henry. So he had Clarence Frogman Henry pick up the second half of the tour, which included New Orleans.
And was there initial like the Beatles wanted to play New Orleans, or it just happened to work out that way?
Oh, there were two small markets the Beatles wanted to play, New Orleans and Las Vegas. They thought Las Vegas was in the wild, wild west, and they wanted to see what it was like to gamble. And they actually had slot machines brought up to their room, which was highly illegal in Las Vegas. But for the Beatles, it was done. They made an exception.
Wow. Well, Bruce, I want to thank you so much. The 60th anniversary, I want to congratulate you on all your amazing work you've done, and then your upcoming books. You are really a treasure to the city and to Beatlemania in general. You've spoken for us a couple of times before, so you're always just a great speaker. So I want to thank you so much for being here, and I hope everyone takes advantage of their spring lectures, and we hope to see you at the symposium or Creole Christmas or for our Carnival class coming up in January. Carnival is coming up. So Bruce, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Glad to have done it. And everyone, you have a wonderful night. And remember, 60 years ago is when it all happened.
There you go. Everybody have a good night.